everyone. How you all doing? I hope you're all good and doing okay. Today, I'm excited about the presentation today and what I'll be talking about. And essentially, I'll be talking about speaking in tongues for two reasons. One is the fact that I've seen that the topic has been kind of one of those conversations that's been coming up on the social media. I've seen one or two commentaries on that and had someone counter the other person and the other person having to respond and, the back and forth. I thought to kind of lend my voice to these conversations. Also because I'm a professional, I'm a psychologist of religion. Actually, I have a PhD in psychology of religion from the University of Groningen, and also have a second PhD in health psychology from Western Sydney University in Australia. And so, and in addition to that, I'm also a professor of psychology in a clinical psychology program, and one of the courses that I teach is psychology of religion for our Doctor of Clinical Psychology students. So I do believe, with a sense of humility, that I might have one or two things to say about the topic, and this is not to talk down on anyone or counter any position or viewpoint. I just want to look at it objectively. Now, for some, they might also wonder how I'm going to approach this topic if I am a psychologist or a scientist and I don't have the religious background needed to kind of talk about the topic in a way that respects the views of people. Well, if it makes any difference, I'm also, in addition to being a psychologist and also a professor of psychology, teaching psychology of religion, I'm also a pastor. In fact, I've actually pastored and served in different ministries around the world, in South Africa, in the Netherlands, in Australia, and sometimes, most often, I frequent traveling to Africa as well to share the gospel. So I do believe that I have some standing, right, to kind of make a case or maybe look at this topic objectively to a extent, hopefully. And so today I do want to talk about speaking in tongues, which, of course, as you know, it's been a phenomenon that's fascinated a lot of people from different cultures and religious traditions for over centuries. And I just want to try to understand what it is and look at some of the historical and also biblical roots and even what modern science can tell us about this very intriguing practice. Of course, as most of you know, I think the Greek word is glossolalia, if you don't mind me mispronouncing that for a sec, which often manifests, this glossolalia kind of manifests as the utterance of sound or speech like syllables, if you will, that are unintelligible to the listener and frequently often to the speaker themselves. So the person speaking speaking in tongues or actually might not even understand what they are saying. It is a practice that's observed. It's a practice that's been observed in many religious ceremonies, especially within Pentecostal and charismatic movements. And also you see this in not just religious ceremonies, also in meditative practice, especially in some religions, even in Judaism. They have those transcendent experience where they could author words. In fact, there are also some studies that looked at similar kind of pattern among people that actually take LED substance, who often articulate words that sometimes may not be intelligible, right? And also this sort of emphasis helps us to see how this sort of transcends, speaking in tongues per se, transcends geographical and cultural boundaries. So it's not something that belongs to a particular movement or a particular religious group or a particular cultural group. I'll come back to that later because people can have this sort of religious experience, but the question is who, I guess, they are communicating or connecting with in that sense. But let's talk a bit about the historical and biblical context, especially since we're focusing on the Christians speaking in tongues. In the New Testament, in the Bible, in the New Testament, glossolalia really is often most famously documented. It's documented during the event of the Pentecost, where the disciples or the apostles were kind of described as speaking in tongues through the influence of the Holy Spirit. And when they did this, they were communicating in languages that were unknown to them. Now, this particular event, I believe, sort of symbolizes the birth of the church in the Bible, and the spreading of its message across different languages and cultures. And so it's important that we kind of get back to understanding how we started and how the conversations around us. It's possible that before this time there were instances where people were speaking on unknown tongues, which might not have been recorded, or may not be outside of the Christian tradition now. However, interpretations of speaking in tongues do vary within Christian theology, because you find that in some denominations like the Pentecostal or Charismatic movements, they view it as a divine gift, right? That kind of allows for direct communication with God. Other denominations within the Christian faith could also interpret these passages, especially the speaking in tongues of the disciples in the book of Acts. They would also interpret this particular experience or narrative more metaphorically, and as such they would often see glossolalia, speaking in tongues, as a symbol of universal reach of the gospel, rather than a literal phenomenon that actually happened where this particular people were speaking in unknown tongues. Now, that interpretation, especially in some Orthodox conservative Christian movements, they interpret that experience as the fact that the gospel has reached in almost all the unknown languages of the then world. So that's one way most people do interpret this. I do think, as a psychological scientist myself, interested in the neurological but also the psychological basis of behavior, I think that scientific research on speaking in tongues, it's important that we look or consider perhaps what might be happening, especially for individuals that might be expressing this particular practice. Now, neurologically, glossolalia, or speaking in tongues, kind of presents a unique case, because I say this because I remember that's a study that was done by some researchers at University of Pennsylvania, kind of revealed that during speaking in tongues, the frontal lobes, which is really the region of the brain that's typically associated with language processing, that this particular region kind of showed decreased activity. Now, this sort of particular incident kind of, I would say, this study or this finding sort of suggests that the usual language centers of the brain are not engaged in the same way during this particular phenomenon when people are speaking in tongues. Now, if this is the case, what part of the brain then it's engaged during speaking in tongues? How can we understand what might be happening? And could there be health benefits, right, linked to this particular scenario where the part of the brain that is responsible for processing speech or language is actually not active? Now, perhaps it's possible that other parts of the brain, particularly those associated with emotional processing, for example, amygdala, might also be more active than the frontal lobes, perhaps. But I think that this particular shift could really imply that speaking in tongue engages more emotionally driven regions of the brain. I'm not sure, because I'm not saying this is what the study is saying. But as for the health benefits, I think that while direct correlations are not definitely established, I believe that it's possible, rather, practices involving deep emotional and spiritual states, like speaking in tongues, could actually potentially have positive effects on mental health, such as maybe things like reducing stress or enhancing a sense of well-being, and also, which, of course, this particular experiences or health benefits are the same thing that we find when we engage in other forms of meditation or spiritual practice. So if the region of the brain that is responsible for processing language is inactive when people are speaking in tongues, perhaps that moment of pause might rather bring about some sense of relaxation for the individual. It's possible. On the other hand, it's also possible that the fact that this particular region of the brain is not active, maybe the part that has to do with the emotional engine room of the brain, particularly the amygdala, might somehow account for the emotional affective demonstrations that we see people have when they speak in tongues, because of course that's a sense of emotion as they exhibit or express whatever they're saying. Now, could it be that those movements or those activities had something to do with how we experience, people experience their health and well-being at the point when they're speaking in tongues? Now, I think that engaging in speaking in tongues could potentially reduce anxiety and stress because it may kind of stimulate parts of the brains associated with emotional processing and relaxation, especially similar to meditation or people having deep prayer. Speaking in tongues can lead to a state of mental focus and relaxation. And this particular focus and relaxation, I think, would provide a sense of peace and emotional release as the individual speaks in tongues. And I think that these mental states are often associated with lower stress levels and even a calmer or even a more centered emotional state. In fact, in clinical practice, there are practices that help people to engage in emotional relief and focus. Psychologically, I think that speaking in tongues, it could be viewed as a deeply emotional or even spiritual experience, one that often occurs in intense religious settings, and it could also perhaps signal a profound state of trance or altered consciousness, which is of course indicative of something that has a deep psychological impact on the individual. But beyond the neurological or psychological explanations, I think from a linguistic analysis or emphasis, I think that speaking in tongues may also have been a subject of interest as well. For example, studies have analyzed its structure, often finding that while it kind of resembles speech, it kind of lacks the consistent syntax and grammar of known languages. In fact, of course, as you would imagine, this sort of raises questions about its clarification as a language. It raises questions about its classification as a language. In fact, linguists would note that speaking in tongues typically follows certain phonetic pattern of the speaker's native language, which I guess it's interesting language. I'm not sure if that is the case, but in other words, what this would suggest is that it has more of a psychological and cultural basis than a linguistic one. But this is not a conclusive statement. It's just some of the things that has been found based on this particular practice. But cultural perspectives and global perspective on this, on speaking in tongues, it's also very important because you find that speaking in tongues in itself, it's not confined to Christianity. In fact, it's observed in various cultural and religious settings worldwide. For example, the shamanistic rituals in Siberia, voodoo ceremonies in places like Haiti, and even the Islamic Sufi practices are just a few examples where similar phenomena occur. I'm not saying that it's the same thing, but it's kind of similar in the sense that people express certain languages or say things, even within cultic practices. They make incantations and chants that sometimes are not as a result of them being enveloped by a particular deity. Now, this universal presence suggests a much deeper, perhaps innate human capacity for such expressions. The fact that beyond just within the Christian faith, that other religious groups also have expression of similar phenomena, I would say that perhaps there is a universal presence of such kind of practice. But interestingly, glossolalia, or rather speaking in tongues, has also been reported in non-religious contexts, like, for example, among individuals under the influence of LSD. And you would imagine that this kind of hints at its possible ties to altered states of consciousness, not necessarily linked to religious experiences per se. It suggests there is an altered state of consciousness as the individual have this experience. But let's kind of focus a bit more on some of the controversies in modern debate. Now, I think that the authenticity and significance of speaking in tongues remains hotly debated. Now, some scientists view it as a psychological or even a neurological artifact, which kind of lacks a genuine linguistic structure. On the other hand, many religious practitioners and believers consider it as a genuine a spiritual experience or genuine divine gift. Like, for example, Christians, especially within the charismatic and Pentecostal movement, actually see speaking in tongues as the gift from God, as it's commonly called the gift of the Spirit. Now, this particular divide kind of represents a broader conversation about the intersection of religious experience and scientific understanding, where both skepticism and belief find strong foothold. And of course, if this is the case, if the due to the ongoing debate about this, about the authenticity and significance of speaking in tongues, we could imagine that that this, of course, would remain, or rather remains, a subject warranting further study and understanding. In fact, this particular divide between scientific skepticism and religious belief kind of highlights the need for continuous dialogue and research into this particular phenomenon. How about maybe church groups, religious groups, or even non-religious group come together, put together resources, fund global research or international research on speaking in tongues, and have the experts, the psychological scientists, the neurologists come together to actually do research and investigate to see what might be happening. And I'm not talking about doing a 1 year, just 2 years, 3 years. I mean, serious research, longitudinal research over the course of a time to really see what's happening. I think that would help to provide clarity around maybe some of the things that's happening. Because I don't believe that this particular kind of research or particular kind of phenomenon is something that can be unpacked just by, let's say, a 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years study, right? But I hope that these discussions can evolve with more interdisciplinary research that kind of combines insight from neuroscience, psychology, linguistics, and even theology. And the reason why it is important because it's that it will help to deepen or steep, or rather deepen our understanding of speaking in tongues and its role in the human experience. And so, as we've explored this topic, I'm hoping that you picked one or two things. My goal is not to dabble into the debate per se, but just to provide insight as to the different viewpoints. But as we've seen, that its complexity, the complexity of speaking in tongues as a phenomenon, kind of spans across neurological, psychological, linguistic, and even cultural domains. And while it's often associated with religious experience, speaking in tongues, I believe, extends beyond into altered states of consciousness in various cultural contexts. Now, in the Christian tradition, the belief is that people speak in tongues as the gift of the Holy Spirit. Now, beyond the Christian tradition, people also see this as an altered state of consciousness. Whether or not this is the same phenomena within the Christian tradition, it's something left for research to decide. But I think that the duality of scientific skepticism and religious beliefs, as you would see, really, kind of underscores the ongoing fascination and debate surrounding speaking in tongues. And so for individuals and societies, it sort of presents a unique intersection of faith, culture, and science. And this intersection kind of, or interplay kind of invites us to rather consider the broader implications of such spiritual practices. But let me end with a biblical reference, because also aside from being a psychological scientist and a professor that teaches psychology of religion, I'm also a Christian. I'm also a pastor. But I think that this particular discussion wouldn't end if we don't reflect from a particular passage in the Bible, which I believe that kind of points to, provides a bit more understanding or context on how we should go about, whether it's debate or discussion, or rather dialogue on this particular topic. I think it's found in 1 Corinthians 14 verse 2. And it says, for one who speaks in tongues, for one who speaks in a tongue, speaks not to men, but to God. For no one understands him, but he authors mysteries in the Spirit. Now, I believe that this particular verse kind of echoes the mysteries and even the transcendent nature of speaking in tongues. In fact, it highlights its spiritual significance in the Christian faith. Now, I think that this reminds me, at least, of the work of a philosopher known as a German philosopher. I can pronounce the name well. He kind of posits that language, it's an activity or a form of life, and only those participating in a particular language game truly understands its nuances. And so in the same way, I think that the efficacy and the spiritual resonance speaking in tongues may be fully appreciated only by those within the Christian community or within the particular Pentecostal and charismatic movements who practice and embrace speaking in tongues. In fact, this particular perspective in philosophy reinforces the idea that spiritual practices like speaking in tongues hold a significance, but also holds a subjective, but also profound significance for those who engage in them. And so, in other words, if you don't speak in tongues and have not experienced it yourself, please do yourself a favor. Shut up.
When you've experienced this, you don't really care what anybody else thinks. It's personal in the first place. It is something between you and God. So we don't really care if it's validated or not, but it's fascinating when it is, so that people that have thought we're crazy can have something to look at to say, maybe we're still crazy. We're just not as crazy as they thought.
Thank you.
And it's been your boy talking to you today, and I hope that you've enjoyed this one. Do share the video if you've liked the content, but really, let's continue this conversation and even think about the next steps, which I believe could be really a much more rigorous research to unpack what's happening. And maybe there is a benefit to this, which we can translate to help humanity. Thank you, and I'll see you on the next one. Bye for now.